Hello, this is the Class 8 video for critical thinking, and in this video I'm covering arrow diagrams for objections. In the previous classes we saw that arrow diagrams were an improvement over standard form because they allow us to represent the relationship between the premises, and they allow us to show how arguments can be strung together in longer chains, where the conclusion of one argument forms the premise of the next argument. Now I want to show how we can use arrow diagrams not just to represent individual arguments, but to represent whole diagrams, whole dialogues between two people. So let's start by reviewing the arrow diagrams themselves. So these are the basic elements of arrow diagrams. The most basic arrow diagram is a single arrow going from one premise to one conclusion, right? That just indicates that statement 1 is evidence for statement 2. The other three basic diagrams show the way that two premises can interact. So if you have conjoint premises, you have a T diagram, and that shows that statements 1 and 2 together support statement 3. And that both statements need to be there in order to have sufficient evidence to believe the conclusion. The other extreme is independent premises. You represent these with a V diagram, where you have two separate lines going to the conclusion. And this means that in each case, statement 1 and statement 2 are on their own sufficient to prove statement 3 in the context that you are working in. But most arguments will actually belong in the middle category of unstructured reasoning. And what this just means is that we don't know the relationship between the two premises. Maybe they operate independently, maybe they work together. So for the simple diagram, I use this example of somewhere in the back of your mind, you might be making an inference like this, right? Today is Tuesday, so tomorrow is Wednesday. When we represented that in standard form, it just became P1, today is Tuesday, and conclusion, tomorrow is Wednesday. For the arrow diagrams, this gives us the simplest diagram, the single arrow. 1, today is Tuesday, and then an arrow pointing down to the number 2, tomorrow is Wednesday. For multiple premise arguments, I gave you a number of examples. But so here was my first example of two conjoint premises. This is the standard argument: all people are mortal. Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is mortal. In this case, premises 1 and 2 together support statement 3. And neither on their own are sufficient to meet the burden of proof. Let's try another example like this. Sid is taller than Bill, and Bill is taller than Jen. Therefore, Sid is taller than Jen. We can represent this with three premises, right? Three statements, and they're going to be conjoint. That is, the two initial statements are both necessary to provide evidence for the third statement. So these statements, these examples contrast with the situation where the two premises are independent and each on its own would be sufficient to support the conclusion. And they also contrast with the unstructured case, where it's simply unclear how many premises you need before you have sufficient evidence for the conclusion in this context. So again, you have the basic diagrams. You have the most basic diagram, a straight line, and then the T, Y, and V diagrams represent conjoint, unstructured, and independent premises. So the next step is to begin to diagram actual conversations between two individuals. And what we're going to be talking about now are objections to an argument, where one speaker gives an argument and another speaker replies. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say that the first speaker always has arguments that point down. All the arrows that point down, they might point down at an angle or they might go straight down, but all of those come from the first speaker. Anything that comes from the second speaker points up. And again, they might be at an angle, but if they're basically going up, it is the second speaker talking. So let's show an example here. Opinion section. Imagine an opinion section from a United States newspaper. This person is arguing that we must intervene militarily in Syria as soon as possible. This is a bit of an old example, but we can now just probably recycle the whole thing for Ukraine. Well, details would have to change. But in any case, Statement 1. The United States government must intervene militarily in Syria as soon as possible. The Syrian government is no longer just shooting protesters. 2. They are bombing one of their own cities with artillery shells, killing thousands indiscriminately. And 3. We have a moral obligation to end this atrocity. So it's clear that this is an argument. There aren't any indicator words in it, but this person is trying to convince the audience that military intervention is necessary, and that is the statement in premise 1. In statement 1, statements 2 and 3 then are premises, and I left out the bit where it says the Syrian government is no longer just shooting protesters, because all that does is set up statement 2. So the thing to see here is that actually the two premises work with each other to reach the conclusion. You've got to have a T diagram here with statements 2 and 3 at the top, and then the arrow going down to statement 1. And this is because if you just had statement 2 on its own, a description of what's happening in Syria, you wouldn't be able to get the normative conclusion that we need to intervene militarily. So you also need statement 3, we have a moral obligation to end this atrocity. All right, so let's go back to chapter 2. What I said there was that whenever you encounter an argument, you want to run two checks. You want to check the reasons and you want to check the reasoning. So you check the reasons. Are the premises true? And then you check the reasoning. If the premises were true, would they support the conclusion? And of course, at the time I said you should always make this a habit. You need to run both of these checks if you want to know if you want to be sure that you are dealing with a good argument. Okay, so let's return to the Syrian argument. Oh, I'm sorry. We would just want to start out, imagine a T argument, and this could be the Syrian argument, this could be anything. We want to see how these two checks play a role in this argument. So if you want to check to see if the premises are true, you're essentially looking at the number 2 and the number 3 up here above the bar, right? And so that's checking the reasons. Are the premises true? There's also this inference here, right, which is the arrow going from 2 to 3 down to 1. If we want to check the inference, we're going to see whether it is valid, strong, or weak. So there are essentially two ways to attack this arrow diagram. You can make an objection to the top of it, or you can make an objection to the middle of it. So let me introduce a bit more of terminology. We're going to say that a solid line supports the truth of the statement or the validity of an inference, and a dotted line denies the truth of a statement or the validity of an inference. So now we've introduced another element. We've introduced the dotted line, and this is a tool that you can use to make objections. Okay. Like to give you an example of how objections work, let's consider 3 possible objections. So there might we had a newspaper editorial advocating military intervention in Syria. We can imagine 3 letters to the editor replying to it. The first letter says this: there's no justification for military intervention in Syria because the rumors that the Syrian government has shelled its own cities are just that, rumors. And actually, if you remember back to the Syrian war, they had shelled their own cities, and the pictures came out of Aleppo, and they just bombed the place flat. But that's neither here nor there. 4 can be plotted as an objection to what we're saying, and this is going to be an objection to the truth of one of the premises, that Syria is bombing its own cities. A second letter to the editor might say this: no one can deny that the Syrian government is violating basic human rights. So yeah, they're bombing their own cities. We have a moral obligation to stop. But U.S. military intervention wouldn't be enough to stop human rights violations. So this is an objection that concedes the truth of both premises, but nevertheless says the conclusion isn't true. And this means that it is an attack on the inference. We can throw in a third way of arguing against it. Yes, the Syrian government is committing atrocities, and yes, the American military could stop them. The problem is, statement 6, that getting involved in another war would destabilize the whole region. That part, I think, turned out to be true. So we have 3 possible objections here, and we've just numbered them 4, 5, and 6. And so what we're doing now is saying that we're going to put these on the diagram as dotted lines. Statement 4 was an objection to the truth of premise 2. So we draw a dotted line going from 4 to 2. Statement 5 was an objection to the inference, because the person who wrote that letter acknowledged that both statements 2 and 3 were true, but they felt that that wasn't enough to show the conclusion. And then statement 6 from the third letter writer just gives an independent reason to not want to intervene militarily. This person is conceding basically everything, but still doesn't want to do it for other reasons. So again, when we represent a speaker and objections, we are going to have the first speaker going down and the second speaker going up. And both of them are going to actually use solid lines and dotted lines. And these will represent either things that assert something, either the truth of a premise or the strength of an inference, or the truth of a conclusion, the truth of any statement, and the strength of an inference. And then the dotted lines provide objections.